Well, welcome back to our course, Writing 242 Technical Communication. And we're continuing in the second section where we're talking about the genres of technical communication. We've now talked about these first three chapters, starting your career, where we talked about resume, cover letter, and portfolio. We talked about the types of technical descriptions that you would encounter, and then we get into more specifics. The first thing we talked about was thinking about technical descriptions and specifications. And so if you have a white paper or codifying the requirements and how things work for a part or something that you've manufactured, that's where we would see that. Now for this chapter, we're going to be talking about instructions and documentation, another very important thing that is going to be necessary so people can get insight into what you're developing. And so this type of material, although at times when you're writing code or developing hardware of one sort or another, maybe you can think that this may not be something you would like to do, but in terms of thinking of the full life cycle and making sure that your product is making the most impact, documentation is extremely important, especially for the end user. So you want to identify three types of documentations, including instructions, specifications, procedures, and protocols. And so here are the three types that we'll be considering. And so we'll be doing the same basic steps. You need to do the plan and the research for the instructions, specifications, and procedures. You want to organize and draft the instructions, specifications, and procedures. You want to develop a style and design that highlights and reinforces the written text. And finally, adapt the documentation to the needs of a transcultural reader. So in case this is an international product or service, or there's a component there, you might need to keep that in mind. So the types of technical specifications, once again, there's three types. So instructions would be number one. And so this describes how to perform a specific task. Number two, specifications, this describes the exact detail of a product, how it is assembled or how its routine process is completed. And then for procedures and protocols, this ensures the consistency and quality in a workplace by describing situations and methods. So that's the kind of technical communication that we're dealing with here. Okay, well, let's step through the various parts of how we develop this technical documentation. And so step number one is the plan and do research. And so we want to ask the 5 W's and the how questions. Who might use this documentation? That's going to help us temper how we're going to write this. Why is it needed? So what is the key things you want to make sure that you state in the purpose? What should it include? And so you want to make sure that it is complete and exhaustive for the purpose of how it's going to be used. Where will it be used? And so that could impact the type of media that is prepared to have it be utilized on. When will it be used and how will it be used? So once you've got that figured out, it's going to be easier for you to be thinking of the subject. What is the purpose? By doing these questions, you're going to have more insight into who the readers are and what is the context of use. So that's the first thing we want to be thinking about, is getting this planning and then doing the research as a fallout of that planning to make sure that you're covered. Well, let's look a little bit more into the research. And so you want to be gaining understanding of your subject from several points of view, from several angles. So do your background research, start to figure out, well, how is this technology or capability likely going to be used? What is a background? What's unique about the things that you're bringing to the table? Make observations, and so be using your senses and take notes about what you're observing and how what you have is this next level and in what specific ways does that actually start to come out. Ask subject matter experts. Use the experts that are at your disposal to help you to go beyond maybe what your basic understanding is. Use your senses. So this is going to help you with the narrative that you can bring in these various ways of communicating effectively and get your readers excited about this. You want to describe the motion and change that's associated with what's being provided here, and then collect visuals. And you're doing the research, you can be getting these graphics and other types of bits of information that will be quite useful. Typically, you run into maybe one or two nuggets that for sure can make a huge difference in the documentation that you're going to be generating. Well, here is a graphical view of what we just spoke about. And so getting this outline and then starting to fill in these details, here are the things that how this would start to be flowing out. So you might find a photograph. And so be able, as you're doing your research, talking with people, that you're able to get that, or request copies of photographs or drawings, or maybe you've got a graphic that is starting to see that would be really great that you use. And so you start to pencil it out, and maybe you have a more advanced graphic team that will make it more appropriate for the final version of the document. So each one of these things that we step through, and so to do the background research, get the history of the product and the processes that you're using, what is the evolution and how things have gone. Refer to any previous documentation that the users might be available. You can be watching other users, and so what do you see that they observe, and so what would be things that you want to make sure that are included. You want to use the product or process, so not only you're having other people use it, but you're out there getting familiar with this. Asking the subject matter experts, what were the trouble spots, and so you can be showing how you're dealing with those. What are the insights that they bring to mind that are useful? Use all of your 5 senses. And so what were some of the observations that you get? Sound, smells, taste, textures, colors, all of these can be helpful as you get into the writing process. I already talked about the collecting visuals. And then finally, describe motion and change. What are the moving parts or changes? And so how is what you're providing going to be helpful for that? Okay, now in step 2, we want to organize a draft. We got all the information we have from our research, and so we're getting to see this general methodology, and we're applying it now more specifically for each forms of these technical communication. Documentation tends to follow a step-by-step pattern. The pattern should change to fit the needs of your subject. And so here are the things that we're starting to be populating each one of these, the outline that we'll have, and the title. This sounds kind of fairly easy to get, but at times you may be needing to get through this other material to come up with a good title and introduction. So you can start to draft some sentences and slowly get into a title that is going to be novel if it needs to be, or very specific. Starting to list the part list. And so here, this is going to be something that you have a technical audience, and so they're looking for specific information. So you need to make sure that that's captured. Is there any safety information for the use of this product or service or capability? What are the steps? And so you're going to be walking through that. You can have graphics that cover those steps and the specifics that need to be going on for each of those steps. And finally, having a conclusion. Okay, well, let's think about sequentially ordering the steps. And so here we can be having a logical mapping to identify the steps in the task. And so how is this actually worked? And so you need to do step 1 before you go to step 2. And so here you can be laying all of those things out. So you have step 1, here are the lower level steps below that. You can have notes that you could be helping the user with, and any hazards. And then you go through step 1, step 2, step 3, all the way up to however many steps are in the logical mapping of what your technical documentation needs to cover. So for writing effective steps, you want to use a command voice. And so this is, you're telling the user how to use this product or service. You want to keep the steps concise, and so precise, but concise, and whatever is necessary to make sure that is going to help you to be able to do that. You want to number the steps, so you do one before you do number two, and working your way through it. You want to add comments, notes, or examples, so in case that they're not quite sure, this will give them more context. You want to provide feedback of like, well, it's been found that this is the kind of things that typically happen, and then you could be referring to the graphics to support the documentation that you're developing. You can have safety information or labeling the hazards. A common convention in technical writing is a 3-level rating. So you can have a danger, a warning, or a caution. And so the most significant would be a risk of serious injury or death is possible. So you want to label that. Warning, injury is likely if the step is handled improperly. So they need to read the instruction carefully. Or finally, caution, damage is something that's, you could damage a product or equipment if it's not used correctly the way it's laid out in the documentation. Finally, the conclusion that signals that the task is complete. You want to conclude your documentation of one of 3 ways. Tell the reader they are finished. Describe the finished product. Mention anything the reader should have learned. And finally, provide troubleshooting information. All very useful things that the reader and user would want to know about. So there's 4 kinds of helpful user testing. First is the read and locate test. And so is a documentation complete? And so someone who is a beta tester or someone who's just reading through your documentation can help you figure that out. Understandability test, is it clear? Maybe someone that hasn't been involved in the documentation, do they interpret your narrative the way you're wanting it to be experienced? In fact, and then looking at the performance test, evaluating those, and finally the safety test. All of those are useful things. So let's look now at step 3, the style, design, and medium. So you want to develop a style and design that highlights and reinforces the written text. So you want to have a plain style with a touch of emotion. So you want to have it sort of clinical in a way, but you want to have a little bit of a touch of emotion. So maybe it might help the reader to stay enthusiastic about what they're trying to work through. This may be a fairly technical document that you have that they need to be very careful with. So use simple words and limit the amount of jargon. You want to define words that might be unfamiliar. So that's going to be helpful. You want to keep sentences short and no compound sentences, a very short type of way that you're communicating, using command or imperative styles for the steps, and keep it simple and do not over explain the steps. So for the functional attractive page layout, incorporate graphics to reinforce the text. Use a 2 or 3 column format to leave room for the graphics. So you want to have the graphics embedded in the document close to where the information is useful. Use boxes, borders, and lines to highlight information, and use headlines that show the levels of the information. So in terms of the graphics that reinforce the written test, number and title your graphics so readers can locate them. Refer to the graphics by number and steps. Put each graphic next to or below the step that refers to it, and check whether the graphic could be misunderstood or offensive. A very important point. So then you want to be thinking about the medium that improves access. You can create a website versions that can be viewed on the screen. And so you have an HTML type of version. You can make a PDF version that can be downloaded or sent as an attachment. Oftentimes that can be extremely useful, that they can have their own repository of information, so they have it readily available the way that they store information for that individual or for that company. You want to use more photographs as illustration in online versions. So just taking advantage of how things are typically done for that type of a media. You want to archive past versions in order to help users find additional information, and then use links to help users find additional information. So in terms of the transcultural documentation, you would have to adapt documentation to the needs of a transcultural set of users. And so think about the verbal considerations. They may be in a sense where they're going to be translating the text. So you want to be using basic English, and it's easy for them to figure that out. You want to check the meanings of names and slogans. And so thus you want to make sure it's not going to be offensive in a cross-cultural situation, something that might come up by accident. For design considerations, use icons carefully and also use images carefully. Things that we might be quite familiar with and it would be straightforward may not be interpreted that way by others. And then for the micro genre, for emergency instructions, things that you have all these warnings, cautions, and stuff like that, these are the things you want to make sure that is clearly conveyed in a transcultural type of arena. So put the title in large lettering, use only one side of a page or placard. You want to be using familiar icons, and there are different types of international icons that they might be more familiar with, and so you might have to keep that in mind. You want to have put group information into visual blocks. With the safety of people first, that's going to be important. Make sure you use a command voice and keep sentences short. You want to be minimizing unnecessary explanation and tell readers to call for help if they run into issues. Okay, that's the end for this lecture. Thank you very much.